Credit Union Broadcast Center. I am here with Joey DeFrancesco, a musician and historian, who is going to be hosting a very cool event coming up. This is actually the 5th annual event at Slater Mill. It is called Blow It Out. I would love to talk about this event. It's obviously Slater Mill, such a historic place here in Rhode Island, home of the Industrial Revolution, and talk to us a little bit about the Blow It Out event, what Blow It Out stands for, and how this event came to be.
Yeah, so I worked at the Slater Mill Museum in Pawtucket for a number of years, just giving the day-to-day tours. And like a lot of early factory museums, the focus on these tours was often kind of the big names there. So like Sam Slater, who constructed a lot of the machinery, like Moses Brown, who financed a lot of it, and then also on the technology. And that sounds very interesting, but I noticed there's also this whole other big piece missing, which was kind of the bigger picture of what this place was, and also just all of the other people involved in this story. So the people actually working in these factories, the people picking and producing the raw materials for these factories, which is of course cotton. So we're talking enslaved people largely on plantations down south. We were missing the story of the resistance that the workers were putting up in the factories, the resistance that these communities were putting up to early industrialization. And Slater Mill is the very first fully functioning factory here in the United States. So this is a really important site to kind of look at these broader themes and look at these kind of really important historical events that not only shaped the 18th century, but really created the whole economic system that we're all still living in today. Right. So Blow It Out is a focused tour delving into these issues at Slater Mill. And we call it Blow It Out because it's happening right around spring. And the factory workers back in the 18th century, early 19th century used to have these big parades, these big festivals called Blow It Out festivals, because they'd be celebrating when they could literally blow out the dimly lit lamps that used to light the factories and which forced them to work long into the night during the winter months. So we're having this at the same time. They would be having these around the spring solstice, right? Today's the first day of spring. This is going to be happening next week. So it's to kind of commemorate some of these early worker festivals that were also acts of resistance.
Right. So how did you get involved in becoming a labor historian? And you yourself are a musician. You are a guitar player for the Downtown Boys, which is really popular, successful punk band coming from Providence. But this is sort of your other passion. How did you get involved in this?
Well, I worked before the museum. I was working at a hotel in downtown Providence, the Renaissance Providence Hotel. And while I was working there, I was also working to form a union at this hotel. So I was deeply involved in the labor movement as myself, a worker, in this case a service worker, and working to organize. So after I left that job at the hotel, I got this job at Slater Mill Museum. So I was coming into it with this mentality of thinking about working people, of thinking about these power dynamics, thinking about these economic structures. And so naturally I was kind of drawn to exploring that part of what was happening at the museum, which led me to then develop this Blow It Out program, this labor history program, which we're continuing to do this year now.
Yeah, it's really cool because even the band is deep rooted in activism, and this event is focused on that. So, as you said, the history at Slater Mill is a little, it's deep. There's a lot there. What do you think is the most important thing for people to learn from the experience of this event and learning about the Slater Mill's history?
I think it's really important for people to go and really learn the tumultuous history of these places, because especially here in Rhode Island, you look around and you see the ruins of this early industrial history everywhere, these mill buildings everywhere, but we kind of just think of them as these empty spaces to be filled, and we don't think about this really violent, dramatic history that took place right here in Rhode Island. Again, this story of workers versus management, the history of enslavement in the United States, right? Here in Rhode Island, these factories, this was the demand side of the slave economy, right? This was who was buying up all of the cotton. This is what made slavery really valuable to Southern plantation owners. So to know these stories, to know where our economy, where the state of Rhode Island, where all this money comes from that actually built this place where we all live, is I think really important to understand our history so we can kind of better go forward in our present.
Wasn't child labor also involved in Slater Mill at some point?
Yeah, for most of its history. So the people who actually worked in the mill were young white children who mostly were in this area. So we're talking kids between 8 and 14 years old who work in these mills for 13, 14 hours a day for maybe 30 to 60 cents a week, which is a really low wage even for this time. And they had kids there, of course, because it was the cheapest people they could get to work in these factories in Rhode Island. And that child labor continued for many, many, many decades afterwards. But when Slater Mill was built in 1793, it was staffed almost entirely just with children. So yeah, we talk about the kids working there and even some of the resistance the kids performed, which just like running away, refusing to work in the factories. So yeah, it's really dark history there. Yeah, you know?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of complicated because the Industrial Revolution was so important to the growth of the country, but with all of this, you know, dark in the history. You had also mentioned the correlation between things that are happening today. You mentioned the rally that happened in Charlottesville and things that we can learn. What do you think are the connections there with the history of that time and things that are happening today?
Well, I think these early factories are the foundations of our economic system, right? They're the foundations of industrial capitalism, and it happened right here in Rhode Island, or it began right here in Rhode Island. This is something with a global connection. So when you see people in this country who are, you know, denying the reality of what slavery was, denying the reality of what the Civil War was about, it's important to go back and look at this and say, not only was this happening down south, but even up north, we have these deep economic connections. And in fact, the wealth created by these early factories is still, you know, everywhere in our economic system. So I think it's really important, especially right now when we're so hotly debating the reality of our history, to go to places like Slater Mill and to see this stuff and see, oh, what built this, what was happening here, and what were all the connections, you know, going out throughout the country and throughout the globe from right here in Rhode Island, right? We think Pawtucket, Rhode Island, we don't think of it being as kind of the center of the economic world, but at one point, this is a really important place, and it's important to know how we've gotten to where we are based on looking at what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, we can't change the past, but we can definitely learn what the truth was and learn from it.
Yeah.
So the event is also going to be incorporating some local artists, musicians, poets. Tell us a little bit about who's going to be performing and why you felt it was important to incorporate art into the event.
Yeah. So we've been doing these for, again, about 5 years, and almost all of them we've been also incorporating an artistic aspect of performance after the tour. And I think this is really important to have for a couple reasons. One is that I think having someone or some people artistically interpret in the same space the history we're talking about helps to bring it into the present, right? To make it clear that this is not history that we're totally divorced from, but is something that is still very much, pertinent to where we are politically, economically in our reality. And then it's also just interesting, I think, for being in Rhode Island, if you're a musician here or a performer here, so much of the arts takes place in these old mill buildings. And it's so often just divorced from context. We think, again, of them as being empty places. We so often even just call them warehouses. Well, most cases there weren't warehouses, right? They were factories, and there was a lot going into them. So I think to see the arts performed very intentionally within that context is also an important thing. So on this tour, we're really excited. We have Shea Rivera performing, who is the artistic director at AS220 and is a wonderful performance artist and poet. She'll be performing, and we also have a performance from Muggs Fogarty, who is also a really wonderful musician and poet here in Providence, who's performing under the name Sweet Pea Pumpkin. So they'll both be performing after the tour, also within the mill space, again, to give it some more context, and I think to bring it home, the connections between the past and where we are now.
Do you know if the pieces that they're going to be performing are inspired by the tour and the history, or is it just sort of something that they feel relates in some way?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? They're going to be working with stuff they have prepared before, but I know they're going to the space beforehand to really kind of work out with the space and within the context of what's happening on the tour and within the factory.
Yeah, cool. I loved what you said about how much art actually happens in these old warehouses or factories. And it's something, it's true, we don't think about it, but in other areas of the country, they don't have this. You know, this is something that's very specific to what was going on here, and now we get to utilize all that space as, work art kind of lofts or performance venues. So yeah, that's a really cool correlation to think about. And they're everywhere. If you turn the camera around, you'd see these brick buildings here in downtown Providence. If you drive around Rhode Island, you see the remnants of all the mill villages that were here at Slatersville, Coventry. You see it everywhere within this state. So I think it just kind of gives you a better, deeper sense of where we live to go on this tour, to go to these kinds of events and understand where it's all coming from. Yeah. Really cool. So I want to talk a little bit about Downtown Boys. It's such I love that you're such this historian guy, but you're also in a punk band. So tell us a little bit about what you guys have been up to. Do you have any shows coming up? I know you guys, like I said, constantly doing stuff. Very, very successful, well known. Tell us a little bit about what you guys have going on.
So Downtown Boys, we released a record last year called Cost of Living, and we toured pretty much the entirety of last year. So right now we're on a little bit of a break
hiatus.
To kind of take it easy. But we'll be playing a little bit this spring. Nothing local planned quite at the moment. But just kind of giving it a little bit of a break after a very, very busy last year.
Sure. Well, Joey, thank you so much for being here today. This event is at Slater Mill, and it's going to be March 29th, 7 p.m. We'll have all the information at GoLocalProv.com. Thanks again for being here. We're going to take a quick pause to set up for my next guest.